When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Some figures shape history, while others are shaped by history. In the case of this episode's primary subjects, an argument can be made that in this instance, it's a little bit of both. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. I had the pleasure this summer to talk with Jordan Cash about his research on John Tyler, Sam Houston, and their respective roles in the annexation of Texas. Jordan is an assistant professor of political theory and constitutional democracy in the James Madison College at Michigan State University. He is the author of The Isolated Presidency, published by Oxford University Press, and Adding the Lone Star, John Tyler, Sam Houston, and the Annexation of Texas, published by the University Press of Kansas. He is also the co-editor of 2 edited volumes, and his work has appeared in a variety of academic journals and popular websites. Prior to teaching at Michigan State, he was a lecturer at Baylor University and the founder and director of the Zavala Program for Constitutional Studies, as well as a postdoctoral research fellow in the Program on Constitutional Democracy at the University of Virginia. His book, Adding the Lone Star, is a fascinating read, and I have no doubt that after you listen to our discussion, it'll be one you want to pick up. I'll have a link to the University Press of Kansas page for his book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my conversation with Jordan.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today on Presidencies.
Thank you for having me.
So, to get us started, you had stated at the beginning of your book that your focus in this work on Texas annexation was to examine how the respective presidents of the U.S. and Texas approached the issue and, quote, how their differing institutional and political context affected their choices and actions in office. In this juxtaposition of these two nations and their governing and political systems, what stood out to you as the strongest contrast? And do you think that either was more conducive to accomplishing the goal of annexation than the other?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think the real strongest contrast between the two nations as a whole, in terms of their political systems, is probably the differences in their party systems. So, of course, the United States at this point in the 1840s has a strong two-party system, the Democrats and the Whigs. John Tyler, of course, in this system, he is a vice president who becomes president after the death of William Henry Harrison. And there's this question of, should he be president? And then he gets kicked out of his own party. He gets kicked out of the Whig Party. So this puts Tyler in a very uncomfortable position of being opposed by the party organizations of both the Democrats and the Whigs in a strong two-party system. So Tyler really only has his constitutional authority to rely on. In Houston's case, in Texas, there really is no party system. Really, the factions that emerge in Texas are you pro or anti-Houston? So this gives Houston a much stronger political position from which he can push annexation, as opposed to Tyler, who's having to weave in between these strong party organizations. So I would say on a kind of macro scale, that's the big difference, is that the United States has strong two parties. Tyler is opposed by both parties, where in Texas, there really are no parties, and Texas is the colossus of Texas politics. One other thing I do want to mention, though, getting down into the executive specifically, into the presidency, I think there's a very important difference in that of course, United States presidency has a 4-year term, can be reelected. So there's the capacity for presidents to think and plan over the long term and to be eligible for reelection in having stability in administration. In Texas, though, it's very different. So Houston, he is the first president of Texas, but under the Texas Constitution, the first president only serves for 2 years, and then he's term limited out. Now, he can come back after an intervening term. So Houston is both the first and third president of Texas because he is forced to leave. He comes back. But even that second term, he's only there for 3 years before he's kicked out again. So there's a constitutional difference with the executives where Tyler has the capacity with his longer term to kind of wait for the right political moment, right? To plan ahead, to think through how these things are going to work. Houston, he doesn't really have the time to create a sustainable annexation policy or to see that his diplomatic efforts are carried out, because when he first tries it, after 2 years, he's out. You get a new Texas president who's anti-annexation, who wants Texas to make a go of it as an independent nation. Then Houston comes back, has to change that policy right around again and pursue annexation. And then Houston doesn't even get to see that quite all the way through because he's out before the American Congress passes the annexation resolution. So thinking through institutional structures, I think this is a very important difference, that Texas politics, despite Houston being really domestically unopposed in important ways, is constitutionally hamstrung by the fact that he can't create a sustainable and stable diplomatic and annexation policy, whereas Tyler may be politically hindered, but has the capacity to have a more stable approach and to be able to pick the right political moment. So these are two big differences that have an important effect on how they approach annexation.
Well, and it's interesting because, we're speaking from a time when it's more of the norm versus the exception, that we have U.S. presidents who have 2 4-year terms, so 8 years in office to see through their policies, versus trying to think through every 3 years, you're going to have a new president some way or another. And it's fascinating to think about and how difficult that would be to craft an actual agenda and to see it through. And especially, one of the things that I was really struck by with your work is that, the in-between period between Sam Houston's 10 years as president of Texas, you have Mirabeau Lamar, who is an anti-Houston. He's opposed to Houston, but the only reason he ended up as president is because he was basically it. He was the guy who was there. So, you made the point of saying, don't see this as, Texas necessarily turning away from Houston. It's just, this was the guy.
Right. So Houston had a couple successors he would have preferred, but they both died before the election. So it's just an unhappy circumstance. And that's something else we can think about is that with Houston, when you have term limits, usually the idea I think in Texas was you don't want a single individual to gain too much power, right? This is something that they likely brought over from their Mexican constitutional heritage, Texas being a Mexican state before achieving independence, that the Mexican Constitution of 1824 set term limits on their presidents. So the Texians did this as well. The problem was, yes, Houston is out of the presidency, But then he just runs and gets into the Texas House, and he pretty much creates his own Houston faction in the Texas Congress. So the power just shifts from the executive to Congress, which creates more problems for Lamar. So it doesn't even have the effect of preventing Houston from accumulating power. It just shifts the locus of that power to a branch which arguably might not be suited to the kind of diplomatic initiatives that Houston is trying to pursue, that it might have been better for him to just stay in the presidency and better for Texas to avoid the disastrous Lamar administration and just have Houston all the way through for a good 8 years or so.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting because I think, and for our listeners who are unfamiliar with the politics and governmental structure of the Republic of Texas, Jordan, I think that your book does a great job in kind of bringing us up to speed on both. And for me, one of the most fascinating facts that you highlight is that these founding fathers of Texas were mostly relative newcomers to the area, including the folks who drafted the 1836 Constitution. And there's, so many figures that you bring up and discuss and kind of the influences that they brought to this process of starting a new nation. So I was wondering, beyond Sam Houston, who we'll come back to in a bit, which figure in Texas politics during this period stood out to you and is worthy of greater scholarly attention?
Yeah, so the person I would think of after Sam Houston that probably deserves more scholarly attention, actually somebody who I barely mentioned in the book. I think I mentioned him in one sentence, and that's Lorenzo de Zavala. So Zavala is really interesting for the career he had prior to coming to Texas. So he's a Mexican statesman who had served in politics before Mexico became independent. I believe he was in the Spanish Cortez briefly as a representative from Mexico. He serves as in diplomatic roles, as a governor of a Mexican state. So he has all these roles in Mexican government. He's even in the Constituent Assembly that writes the Mexican Constitution of 1824. So he has experience writing a national constitution. But he's an enemy of Santa Anna, who, of course, comes to dominate Mexican politics in this period. And essentially, Zavala has to go into exile. And notably, during his exile, he even writes a book about his travels, specifically his travels in what he calls the United States of North America, right, to distinguish it from the United States of Mexico, which comes out a year before Alexis de Tocqueville's more famous Democracy in America. Now, Tocqueville, more theoretically sophisticated, but still Zavala is giving us an interesting view on antebellum politics, and this time from a Mexican perspective. But Zavala eventually makes it to Texas, and as you said, he's one of these newcomers who are then thrown into the Texas Revolution. He becomes a revolutionary, a traitor to Mexico, essentially, and serves in the convention which writes the Texas Constitution of 1836. So he contributed to writing not only the Mexican Constitution, but now also the Texian Constitution as well. And he's even made the provisional vice president of Texas until a election for the constitutional presidency that Sam Houston wins can be held. He dies soon after the revolution is over, so I think that contributes to maybe him not being as well known historically. But for someone who had this long career in politics in both Mexico, in Texas, who wrote about the United States, I think this is a very interesting figure who, as you said in your question, deserves more scholarly study, specifically since he had all this experience in writing and participating in developing national constitutions, and in a way bringing that element of Mexican constitutionalism to this new Texas constitutionalism, which I think we can learn a lot by, and what I try to do in the book, by bringing in where there are Mexican influences in the Texas constitutional system, as well as the American influences.
And I think that's something key here for our listeners, and also for really trying to understand the historical moment. And I think you do a great job in your book, Jordan. I've read of, the Texas Revolution numerous times from more of the American context. And so, of course, there's a big emphasis on that the U.S. Constitution served as an influence on the Texas Constitution. But you rightly point out that there are these other influences, and there are people who are there who are not necessarily from an American perspective, who are bringing in other perspectives from Mexico from more the local areas, and you've got even the Spanish legal tradition, that all of this is coming together. And I think that's important to understanding what's happening in Texas. Yes, there is a big American influence, and there's so much more that leads to what this government becomes.
Right. Yeah. And I think when we look at examples like Texas, this is one of the few instances where you have Americans writing a national constitution after 1787, right? The United States isn't like France that had a bunch of Republican constitutions and new republics, fourth and fifth republics. No, we've only had the one constitution. So when we have these examples of Americans being involved in writing a national constitution, even when they do take the American Constitution as a model, we can see these differences as, I think, really telling about what are these Americans post 1787 thinking when they're forming a new national government? How do they want to shape their institutions? And once we identify those differences, we have to ask, well, where are they getting that from? Right? Is that a response to political developments since 1787? Is it a response to simply who the people in this group of people are? In this case, I think there's a little bit of both, because you do see, as you said, the influence of Mexican constitutionalism, the Spanish legal tradition, Texas's own, its time as a Mexican state, its prior political history. So there are certain things that the Texians had just developed over time that they thought, well, this works. This seems to work for us. Let's keep this going. And then there are a few elements where they are responding to political developments in the United States and say, well, let's just avoid all of that and change our constitution in this way. So, for example, questions about, can the president remove cabinet officers? This is a big debate in the 1830s, and that the Texians would have been well aware of. And they said, well, let's just put it in our constitution that the Senate has to advise and consent on removals, just like they do on appointments. So they not only are they drawing from this Mexican influence, from their own local and state influence, drawing from American state constitutions. Several delegates had been authors of state constitutions previously, or at least in the conventions where state constitutions were written, but also looking at contemporary debates and saying, well, what do we like? What do we don't like? What are new developments you can respond to? And so whenever we look at these constitutions, and especially instances of Americans writing new national constitutions, I think we have to take those things into account and try to figure out where are they coming from, and what does it mean then for this constitution to be shaped by these different factors, by these different influences. And then, of course, the big question really, how does it work? Do these changes actually improve upon the original, in this case, the American Constitution, or are they creating new problems that perhaps the other constitutions, either in the United States or in Mexico, didn't have?
And then you've got the X factor, and we've seen this in presidencies as we've explored various presidencies beyond just the theoretical, we're writing a constitution, here's how the government's going to work. It also depends on the people who are holding these offices, who are influencing how it actually works in real time. And so you've got the person that we've talked about already who was this major influence, Sam Houston. And as you described, Houston was really a big fish in the small pond of Texas politics. This was somebody who had already been involved in politics in the U.S. He was seen as a protege of Andrew Jackson. And this past, how he came to Texas and this experience that he already had kind of allowed him to dominate the Republic's politics in a way that he wasn't able to replicate in his political career in the U.S. either before or after. And so, Jordan, I was wondering, what do you feel was Houston's greatest leadership quality? And would you consider his 2 terms as president of Texas to have been successful ones?
Yeah, good question. So I would say, in terms of his leadership qualities, his persistence, and we might even say his resilience, I think, are very important for looking at Houston. I mean, this is a man who, when he enters politics, he kind of shoots up the ladder very quickly, right? He's connected to Andrew Jackson, as you mentioned, considered in some ways Jackson's chief lieutenant. He serves in Congress, a congressman from Tennessee. Then, with Jackson's support and influence, he becomes the governor of Tennessee. And it really looks like Houston is on the fast track to be Jackson's successor, that he's positioned as governor of Tennessee. Of course, Jackson is from Tennessee, to kind of create a Tennessee dynasty akin to what we saw with Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. It seemed like it's going to go Jackson and then Houston. And we'll talk about Polk a little bit later, but maybe that would have been the third one. But that, of course, isn't what happens. Houston has a disastrous divorce. He's in some ways disgraced on a personal level. He resigns the governorship of Tennessee and goes into a little bit of a political exile until he finally crosses and goes into Texas. And then suddenly a revolution breaks out. He becomes the commander-in-chief and rises to be, in this case, not even Andrew Jackson, but the George Washington of Texas, right? This dominant political figure. And even as president, when we talk about annexation in particular, he keeps trying to push for it, and the U.S. turns him down. His old mentor Jackson turns him down for annexation, right? They're not interested. Then Van Buren, his old Jacksonian ally, turns him down. Even Tyler initially turns him down. So he keeps having to press and be persistent and find new strategies, new ways to get the United States to really come around to his way of thinking, to do what he wants them to do. So that kind of persistence, that resiliency, not only in his own personal life, but then in a position of leadership, I think is a really important thing about Houston and a key to his success. And of course, that persists even after after he's president of Texas, when he becomes a senator from Texas back in the U.S. Senate, and then at the end of his life, the governor of Texas. To your second question about were Houston's 2 terms as president successful, I would say generally speaking, yes. As successful as they can be for a president of a very small republic wedged in between much stronger neighbors, one of whom is very hostile in Mexico, and the other of whom, the United States, is relatively indifferent. Then you've got the Europeans kind of scheming along there too. So Houston, I think, does an excellent job of weaving between all these different factors, all these major powers, and really positioning them in a way that they do what he wants them to do. Starting to ally with Great Britain and France in such a way that spooks the Americans into acting to start supporting annexation. And again, allying with Britain and France in a way that convinces Mexico to not just have a full-blown reconquest of Texas. And of course, the fact that he does get diplomatic recognition of Texas from the United States and from European powers, and that he does achieve annexation. His major policy goals, he does meet them. Of course, there's some bumps along the way. Like I said, it takes a lot of effort. But overall, his key issues do get done. And I would say that does mean it was a fairly successful presidency.
And kind of sticking with that foreign policy for a minute, because that is one thing that you highlight in your work, is that this is a very small republic stuck in the middle of these larger nations, and it's difficult to navigate. They've already fought a war with Mexico to achieve independence, and they're still struggling throughout the history of the Republic of Texas to either figure out how to avoid war with Mexico or how to go back into war with Mexico, how to get annexed by the U.S. And so there's so much going on here. And you highlight how Houston had the strategy of making diplomatic overtures to Britain and France in order to play them off against the U.S. and Mexico, and really with this ultimate goal in mind of securing Texas annexation. And this is a strategy that we see in the diplomacy of the early republic in terms of American foreign policy towards major European powers, as well as the diplomacy of native nations with the U.S. And so I was wondering, how much do you think Houston's unique background prior to becoming the president of Texas came to play in shaping this approach?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Admittedly, one I hadn't really thought about that much. I think when it comes to Houston's background, I think it is very helpful that he had served in the military, under Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812 and with some of the wars with Native Americans. So he kind of had this sense of strategy and of military strategy, what it required. And Two, you spoke about how this was a strategy that Native Americans had. Houston, of course, had lived with the Cherokee for quite a while. He was even given the name the Raven in the Cherokee language, and the Raven was considered a very unique bird in Cherokee mythology. So Houston, having this background in the military, in the American military, living with Native Americans, I think he would have seen the ways in which you have to strategize from a position of weakness. And the fact that he had been commander-in-chief in Texas fighting the much stronger Mexican government. Santa Anna had a much stronger military than Sam Houston. For a while during the Revolution, Houston is leading a retreat and kind of ceding a lot of ground to Mexico. It's not very successful. It's almost lucky that they actually win in that they happen to get information where they can find Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto and capture Santa Anna in a very quick battle. Otherwise, if it had gone much longer, or if they had had the kind of pitched battle that Santa Anna was looking for, it probably goes a very different way. But that experience, understanding intuitively the need to be strategic, to be smart, the need to see that Texas can't just force their way, but they have to be able to play off much stronger powers and just keep, kind of like the Texas Army. Houston just had to keep it together long enough to find that perfect time to strike. He just needs to keep the Republic of Texas existing long enough for it to either gain peace with Mexico or to be annexed to the United States, in which case Texas's defense become an American problem, not just a Texian problem, right? So I think you put all those things together, then yeah, in a way, Houston's history, his experience, his persistence, as I mentioned earlier, all create a perfect storm for somebody who can hold this republic together just long enough and create a really quite astute grand strategy and astute foreign policy that manages to hit all the right buttons at just about the right time to achieve success.
Well, and it's interesting, as you were talking, Jordan, I came back to this parallel with George Washington. And again, that idea of persistence seems to be something that is really a strong theme in Washington's history, both in the Continental Army, this idea of just keeping the army together, even if we have to retreat, it's still being strategic until you get the right moment. And likewise with his presidency, realizing the position that this new nation was in, still trying to build up and not wanting to necessarily go to war with larger powers, but also needing to play them against one another in order to just keep the nation together, keep the nation going. And I wondered whether that was an active or just kind of an example that was in the back of Houston's mind of George Washington while he was trying to lead in these difficult positions.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I haven't come across anything where Houston explicitly writes, I took George Washington as my model in these various areas. But I think you're right to draw the comparison. I say at one point in the book that Houston's position is much more akin to Washington in the early republic than it is to an Andrew Jackson or a John Tyler in terms of the kind of things that they're having to deal with, both in terms of political pressures, but also the foreign policy, the geopolitical situation. So even though I can't think of a place where Houston directly says, I took Washington for my model, I think knowing Houston, he would have known history, he read a ton. So I think he would have been well aware of Washington's history, both as a general and as president. I'd be shocked if it wasn't at least in the back of Houston's mind that this is the way you can do these sorts of things. And really the way to achieve success, as I said earlier, from a position of weakness. And how do you confront an existential crisis when it seems like you're the smallest fish in a very large pond with a lot of very large and hungry fish? How do you survive this? I think you're right to draw that comparison. And as I said, I'd be shocked if Houston didn't at least see himself in a similar position, even if he didn't directly compare himself to Washington.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, in turning our conversation, you had mentioned him, the other president in this equation, who I don't think anybody would necessarily compare to George Washington or see as a parallel, because he's never going to be considered one of our most successful presidents. But John Tyler, you do rightly credit him in your book with, quote, using his executive authority effectively, particularly when it came to Texas annexation. So, Jordan, I was wondering, what do you think was the most pivotal move that Tyler made to secure the annexation? And do you think that Tyler had to circumvent his political ideology, which tended more towards a strict interpretation of the Constitution, in order to achieve his goal of bringing Texas into the Union?
To begin with the first question, I'd say the most pivotal move Tyler made, we could almost say the theme of this episode is persistence, was his persistence in continuing to pursue annexation even after the treaty failed. So to just go back a little bit, Tyler initially had opened up secret negotiations with Texas about annexation with the Houston administration, and then he presents the Senate with a completed treaty in the spring of 1844. The Senate, though, rejects the treaty, and not even by a close margin. It's an overwhelming 2/3 of the Senate vote against the annexation treaty. Now, Tyler could say, okay, well, we tried. Sorry, Sam. We're moving on. We can't keep this up. But instead, he almost immediately pivots to say, okay, well, if we can't do it by treaty, let's annex Texas under the admissions clause of the Constitution. Because the admissions clause says that a state can be added to the Union with a majority vote of both houses of Congress. And I would say that's the pivotal move. Not only because it keeps annexation alive, but then because it's an election year, Tyler announces this at about the same time that the presidential election of 1804 really kicks up. So the choice to keep pursuing annexation, having this unique, really novel interpretation of the admissions clause, which I'll address in regard to your second question here in a minute, but then also tying it to the election, right? Tying it to specifically James K. Polk. Polk being the Democratic nominee for president who comes out on a pro-annexation platform, opposing Henry Clay, who kind of waffled a little bit, but generally speaking was on an anti-annexation platform that allowed Tyler, when Polk ultimately wins, to say, look, annexation is popular. The states and the people have voted for it, right? In that the Electoral College is made up of states, but you also have a popular vote. And so then he can push it through with that congressional resolution that he had already turned Congress's attention to months earlier. Again, that persistence, I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to keep pushing forward until I'm finally vindicated, I think was the most important thing that Tyler did for annexation. To the question of constitutional interpretation or Tyler's principles, that's an interesting one because on the one hand, you could say Tyler's following the principles he's had for years. He's a proponent of Western expansion. He was a proponent of, adding Missouri to the Union. So that is a consistent theme with Tyler is he wants the United States to expand to the West. And as he writes in a letter to his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, what could put a greater luster on us than the annexation of Texas? He sees Texas adding a new star to the Union as the greatest thing he could possibly do at the end of his term. So in that sense, Tyler's being perfectly consistent with his principles. The question, I think, is more about the strict construction of the Constitution. Because Tyler is a Jeffersonian. His dad had been a roommate of Thomas Jefferson's at William and Mary. He was kind of groomed as a Jeffersonian devotee of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Those were his heroes growing up. And so when it comes to, is the annexation of Texas, is this congressional resolution the proper constitutional way to bring in new territory? It's a dicey proposition. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, comes out of retirement. I think he's in his 80s at this point and says, this is completely improper. This isn't the way you should do this. But Tyler says, nope, we can do this. So it's hard to say because technically speaking, you could make the argument that, well, he is adding a state. That's what the admissions clause is for, is to add states. The novel part of it is the fact that usually when you added states, it was already American territory, and it had been territory American territory for a while. But now to say, oh, we're going to add this new state that's never been American territory, that's the novel part. But technically speaking, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't do that. So I said it's tricky earlier. I think it is quite tricky in that, strictly speaking, like, is he going with the letter of the law or the spirit? And you could say he's not really going with the spirit of it. Well, you could even just say this is a constitutional ambiguity. The Constitution doesn't say. And so Tyler is resolving an ambiguity that's simply in a different way than Gallatin did. It's not that dissimilar to Thomas Jefferson saying, well, I'm not sure we can constitutionally do the Louisiana Purchase. And Madison and Gallatin at the time saying, well, yes, we can. The Constitution allows for this. It's capacious enough to allow this under the treaty power. Tyler's just saying, well, maybe the admissions clause is broad enough to allow this as well. So I hesitate to say that Tyler violated his principles under strict construction of the Constitution. I would more say he's giving an interpretation that seems to resolve an ambiguity that notably later presidents like William McKinley in the annexation of Hawaii pretty much followed the Tyler playbook. So he's a constitutional innovator in that way. Whether Jefferson would have approved, as Gallatin said he wouldn't have approved, always hard to say at this point.
Absolutely. Well, and, with Tyler, this is one of the things, and I think one of the reasons I encourage folks to learn more about the Tyler presidency, because this isn't the only time that he does this. And, we see, and this kind of gets to, because I wanted to ask about your other book, The Isolated Presidency, which unfortunately I did not have a chance to read before our conversation, but I do look forward to reading very soon. But this idea of Tyler taking these interpretations and trying to solve some ambiguities in the Constitution just by the nature of him being president, period, versus this idea of the vice president being acting president in the absence of the elected president. That was something, again, like with this case, Tyler went ahead and said, no, I'm the president. I'm not acting president. I am just the president, period. And so I wanted to ask you, Jordan, about what legacy do you think Tyler left for the office of the presidency, and how does the Texas question factor into that?
Sure. Well, I would say Tyler's primary legacy is constitutional. You mentioned the fact that when William Henry Harrison died, Tyler's vice president succeeds to the office. There was this question: does he become the president, or is he just the acting president? He's going to have all the powers, but he's not really the legitimate president. We just got to wait until we have another election, and then we'll get a real president back, right? And Tyler says, no, I am the president. So he establishes the Tyler precedent, right? The vice president becomes the president when there's a vacancy in the office. That's not codified in the Constitution until the 25th Amendment. So every vice president between 1841 and I think it's about 1965, 66, when they become president, is just following the Tyler precedent. They're just following the interpretation that John Tyler had set, but which wasn't, strictly speaking, written into the Constitution. And then, of course, the interpretation of the admissions clause, as I mentioned earlier, is a big constitutional innovation. But even more broadly, I would say Tyler's primary legacy is defending the presidency, defending the constitutional authority of the office, because we have to remember the position he was in. So Tyler had been a member of the Whig Party, but the Whigs, the primary doctrine that held the Whig Party together, which was a fairly disparate coalition, but the one thing they all agreed on was restraining executive power. They didn't like how Andrew Jackson had used presidential authority, so the Whigs as a party were devoted to restraining executive power. And that's what gets Tyler in trouble when he becomes president is, he may have agreed with that before, but then he becomes president and it turns out, oh, presidential power is pretty neat. I like it a lot. I'm going to veto stuff. I'm going to exercise my authority as robustly as I'm able, which is a natural thing. In fact, it's kind of what the Constitution expects when James Madison in Federalist 51 talks about, the interests of the man must become connected with the constitutional rights of the place. The interests of the man, Tyler, became connected with the constitutional rights of the place, the presidency. So it's to be expected. But the Whigs didn't like that. That's why Tyler gets kicked out of the party. And the Whigs kept trying to restrain executive power. And they had majorities in Congress. They could have done so. A president who went along with what the Whigs in Congress wanted to do, it could have unbalanced the constitutional system. It could have set a precedent that presidents should be weak, that they should just do what Congress tells them to do, be Congress's errand boys in a way. But Tyler asserts himself. He asserts the power of his office. He asserts executive independence. He asserts that the executive is going to be able to veto things. He asserts that he's going to keep recommending legislation and make his appointments and remove officials when he deems it necessary. All these core powers of the office that really we take for granted were in a tricky situation. It was almost a tipping point. So the fact that Tyler asserts himself, he defends the essential prerogatives of the presidency, defends the constitutional presidency, and in doing so also has these constitutional innovations, resolving some of these ambiguities. I think that's Tyler's essential legacy, is upholding the constitutional presidency, making these constitutional innovations, but really preserving the constitutional system as it had been constructed and as we know it today, and preventing the separation of powers and checks and balances from becoming a system of just legislative supremacy and a kind of quasi-parliamentary system.
Well, and it's interesting because, of course, this is one of the key points and the key themes in the Tyler presidency, but we were even starting to see this in Harrison's short presidency, this idea that Whigs had of a limited presidency. And with Harrison, he was starting to run up against his cabinet, this idea that the president should be one vote equal with the cabinet. And if the majority didn't agree, even if the president thought one way, you went with the majority. And even though it wouldn't have come necessarily to the extremes that it did with the Tyler presidency of him being, voted out of the party, kicked out, I think that there was still that clash that was coming even with Harrison. But it's interesting that Tyler, in a place, and I think this also gets back to the people at the certain time in the office. There are other folks who may have just acquiesced and said, well, you're right. I'm not really the president that was elected. I was elected vice president. Maybe you're right. Tyler had that conviction to say, no, the presidency must be preserved. And I think that has had a profound influence on future presidential history and on American history.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to remember, too, it would have been easier for Tyler to do that, right? It would have been easier for him to just acquiesce and go along with Congress. He put himself in a very difficult position by not doing that, by insisting on his presidential authority, which he felt kind of was obligated by the Constitution, by his constitutional oath. But yeah, he would have had a much easier time. Congress wouldn't have kicked him out of the party. There wouldn't have been articles of impeachment introduced. So he wasn't impeached, but it was the first time that articles were introduced against a president, basically because he vetoed too much, was the argument. And so the fact that he, again, stood on principle, stood on his convictions of needing to uphold the office of the presidency, I think is very important because, yeah, you're right. It may not all presidents may have done that, or not all individuals may have done that. And you could see an instance where somebody who wants to just take it easy, go along, get along, might have gone along with it, much to the detriment of the constitutional system.
Well, and it's interesting because I think you highlight in your work that there are these crucial turning points that if things had gone differently, we could have ended up in a completely different situation for better or worse. And even though we know Texas ultimately came to be a part of the Union, as you note, the election of 1844 was a close one. And if a few thousand votes in New York had shifted, Henry Clay, rather than James K. Polk, might have been the 11th U.S. president. So I was wondering, how do you think that Tyler would have proceeded with the Texas annexation, knowing that Clay was his successor? And if it didn't happen in 1845, do you think that the push for Texas joining the Union would have fizzled out?
Yeah, these are good questions. Of course, it's always hard to know what an alternative history looks like. My general thought is, even if Clay had won, given Tyler's aggressiveness, we might say, using his powers, and the fact that he'd already introduced this congressional resolution method of annexing Texas, I think he probably would have given it a shot, and tried to push it through in his last days in office. I just think it wouldn't have worked. He wouldn't have had the same capacity to call upon popular opinion to say that the people were behind him as expressed in this election. So I don't think it would have happened in 1845. Now, that said, I don't think it would have necessarily fizzled out. Because even Clay, when he's running for president, says that his main opposition is to immediate annexation, right? So he leaves the door open on possible annexation later on. Now, that's what gets him into trouble, because then even his supporters, they don't really, it starts to become unclear. Okay, he's broadly anti-annexation, but he also says just not right now. So which is it? So that does seem to cost Clay some support, especially among those who might have been stronger anti-annexationists. I think given how the United States was going, and even Clay's kind of wishy-washiness on it, my instinct is to say that Texas would have eventually been annexed. And of course, the support within Texas too. Houston was getting a little bitter about it because it kept trying and then it not happening. So he does have a line at one point that if this doesn't go through, then we're just not going to deal with it anymore. But of course, that was to the treaty, and then the congressional resolution comes up and Houston still goes along with it. So I think there was enough support, especially in Texas, even in the United States, that it wouldn't have necessarily fizzled out. How it might have come about, though, I think is a much more difficult question, because you could see a scenario where Mexico, learning of this annexation effort, does reinvade. Perhaps you even still have the Mexican War in some capacity. But I don't think it completely fizzled out. What would happen beyond that is beyond my powers of perception to guess at.
Well, and it's interesting because and I think you make the point in your book, and I do invite our listeners to read your book because there's so much more that's wrapped up in this idea of Texas annexation. Of course, you've got issues with slavery. You've got larger economic trends going on. You've got so much happening on the global stage. There's so much more that ties into this, and it is hard to try and piece together what might have happened either way, what would have happened when, if, but it is so fascinating to explore and to consider, because it really does help us to understand how these disparate points, these disparate influences help to make this moment that, it was a key moment for American history and for the development of the United States. And of course, on presidencies, we'll explore more of this as we go along, because there's so much more to say about this. But since these two figures, Sam Houston and John Tyler, are really at the core of your work, Jordan, I wanted to wrap up our conversation because you also take us a little into the future. Once we get past this moment of annexation, what happens to these two individuals? And while both would have some involvement in politics post-annexation, Houston more than Tyler, the early 1840s was really the apex of the respective careers of both men. And so I was wondering, what was the most surprising thing that you learned while researching this pivotal time in not only the lives of Tyler and Houston, but in the history of the nation? And what would you see as the key takeaway for the audience from your work?
Yeah, so I'd say for Tyler and Houston, one thing that very much surprised me that I didn't expect to find was the fact that they actually have a little bit of a public spat over Texas annexation a few years later, really about who deserves credit. Because Tyler's Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, had kind of gone on and saying he deserved credit. So Tyler writes something about that. And then Houston takes exception to what Tyler said. So you have this back and forth in the public press between these two former presidents about Texas annexation. And Tyler saying that Houston was playing the coquette with England, and Houston saying, well, we wouldn't have done any of that if you had just annexed us earlier. So that was just an interesting and I think a fun little thing to see these two going back and forth. Ultimately, they reconcile and kind of move past it. But as far as I could tell, that was the only time that they really communicated, even post-annexation or after they were out of office, and that it was a fight over who should be credited with the actual annexation of Texas. To their more personal stories, the fact that Tyler then, he's in retirement, but when secession happens, that Tyler is a key figure, first in trying to have a peace conference. So he's one of these, he participates in a big push to have a peace conference. He wants it to just be the border states, then all the states come in, which just makes everything more complicated. He meets with Lincoln, President-elect Lincoln at this point, trying to convince Lincoln to find a peaceful solution to all this. But then he goes ahead and goes along with secession when Virginia indicates that it's going to be going that way, and gets elected to the provisional Confederate House, is influential in making the Confederate capital Richmond. So in some ways I think Tyler has been called this before, the traitor president, that when he dies in 1862, it's as a member of the Confederacy. He's waiting for the Confederate House of Representatives to convene so he can serve in the Confederate House. The flag that is over his casket is the Confederate flag. It's not the American flag. So that's a very interesting turn of events for Tyler. And, looking at Houston, that he has a very different outcome, and he's trying to keep Texas in the Union as governor of Texas. And when Texas secedes, he has a different tact to it, where he tries to say, okay, well, Texas has seceded, but that just means we're the Republic of Texas again. We'll just be independent again. We won't join the Confederacy. But then Texas joins the Confederacy against his wishes, and they just declare the governorship vacant. So it's an interesting parallel between the two, that Houston, this massive figure in Texas politics, ends his career by getting kicked out by the Texans who want to join the Confederacy, that Houston loses ends his political career trying to keep Texas into the Union that he had fought so hard to get it annexed to. And Tyler, by contrast, ends his life serving a different government than the one one who's rebelling against the government he had presided over less than 20 years before. And that secession kind of breathes new life into Tyler's political relevance. So it's a very interesting contrast that Houston kind of goes down into, I guess, I don't want to say failure, but it's an ignominious end for Houston's political career, while Tyler is then honored by the Confederacy. Of course, now, 200 years later, we look at Tyler's end with a lot of dishonor, and Houston as more of a hero in that respect. So again, the parallels between the two, that their presidencies were in such different institutional and political conditions, their careers end in such different ways, and really their historical reputations are quite different as well as a result. But then your last question, the key takeaway. I'd say the key takeaway from this book, and to a certain extent the other book, but definitely in this book, is the primacy of constitutional presidential power, especially in foreign policy. Texas annexation is driven by presidents. This is the policy of presidents all the way down across the board in the United States, in Texas. And it really points to the fact that presidents are the focal point of American foreign policy, but also, in that case, Texian foreign policy. And it's the Constitution that positions presidents to have this incredible role in directing how the nation is going to interact with other nations. So as we think about the presidents, as you go through the presidents in your podcast, I'd encourage your listeners to think about that, how the Constitution positions presidents to have this great authority and how it influences them to behave. And I think we see that clearly in both Tyler and Houston, demonstrating the immense authority presidents have in foreign policy, but also the impact that constitutional structures, constitutional powers have on the way presidents behave.
And the premise of this book, this parallel, this contrast between these two individuals, between these two nations, between these two systems, it's just such a fascinating concept. It was a wonderful, amazing read. There is so much more beyond what we were able to talk about in this book. So I highly encourage our listeners to pick up Adding the Lone Star, John Tyler, Sam Houston, and the Annexation of Texas. It is an amazing read for understanding this pivotal point in the history of North America. So I highly encourage you to check it out. Jordan, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insight with us today and for this amazing book. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much again to Jordan Cash for his time and the insight that he provided in our discussion. And be sure to check out Adding the Lone Star, John Tyler, Sam Houston, and the Annexation of Texas to learn more. A link to where you can purchase a copy of his book for yourself will be on the page for this episode at my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to learn more about all of the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Whether you become a patron for as little as $1 a month by going to patreon.com/presidencies and signing up, or you leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, or you share information about this podcast with that history lover in your life, and you know there's at least one. I cannot thank you enough for all the support that folks have provided to date. The podcast will be celebrating its 8th anniversary this coming January, and we couldn't have made it to this point without all of you. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you all for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
An airliner heads for Alaska with 101 passengers and crew. Then, somewhere over the Gulf of Alaska, Flight 293 slams into the icy waters below.
Even if all 4 engines quit, it just doesn't fall out of the sky.
No bodies were recovered. Loved ones had no closure and were left to wonder.
What happened to Flight 293?
Unsolved Histories, What Happened to Flight 293 is available now, wherever you get your podcasts.